conversation about learning and behavior change. You will note that many of these methods have been used for centuries, really, to train and domesticate animals. And my message for this really is that these are not things that were invented. They were things that were discovered through examining them through the scientific method. So B.F. Skinner didn't invent reward and punishment. Uh, uh, and Pavlov didn't invent associative learning or classical conditioning. These were things that have just been given definition by these individuals, but we've been doing them for probably millennia to shape not only animal behavior, but also the behavior of children and adults and the like. So I just wanted to bring that up. But if you did notice, he did mention a few of the people we talked about yesterday. The one that he did mention was B.F. Skinner, which I want to just differentiate the difference between associative learning and reward and punishment, or operant learning or operant conditioning, okay? Associative learning is when you do not have to operate or behave in a certain way in order to learn the association with something. So, for example, in this example, associating a shot or a needle with the doctor's office raises apprehension in the child about going to the doctor, and they may not want to. I saw this famously in my dogs. They knew the building that we were approaching, and we'd have to carry them in. But it doesn't take anything. It doesn't take the person operating in it. So, and I mentioned yesterday, for example, the kitchen and food and those kinds of things. And I will say that the majority of how we learn does occur through this associative learning. Okay, so for example, you don't need to be rewarded if you're a student and you walk in a classroom and you sit at a student's desk. That's just something that has been associated over time and hasn't taken any more reward or punishment in order to shape that behavior. Okay. And also, you know, we've talked about the biological drives of things like attraction and stuff like this. It's through associative learning that we actually get our what are called our idiosyncratic preferences. So while there's general people that we find attractive, that we can kind of say for the, you know, greater than 50%, this type of person, this wide eye sets, all these kinds of things, it's through associative learning and having positive emotions with certain people and negative emotions with certain people and exciting emotions with some people that we shape our idiosyncratic preferences. So some people like, what's the words I see lately? Uh, Dad bods, mom bods, skinny people, chubby people. All of those things are shaped through classical conditioning, the same as our food preferences. Okay, so there's a whole wide world that we associate with classical conditioning. Okay, operant conditioning is the typical kind of thing you think about when you're trying to train your dog or train your child or train your boyfriend to behave in a certain way, where you either reward certain behaviors you want to see and you punish some behaviors you don't want to see. Okay. And as you probably have noted, that this does not always work with human beings. Sometimes it doesn't even work with our pets. But we will see see some of the reasons why it doesn't necessarily work with humans and with other species that we've lived with for a very long time. So but operant conditioning has to do with behavior. That's the reason it's called operant. You're operating, and then the consequence determines whether you do that behavior more or less in the future. Okay. So to start, as I mentioned yesterday, classical conditioning, and the reason I really wanted to go through this experiment today was because there's some terminology that I want you all to know. Okay, because it'll come up uh, in the future on a quiz maybe. Um, and that is, so as I mentioned yesterday, what Pavlov was originally doing was trying to determine the whether the intensity of the smell of meat powder, as the example that they used, increases or decreases the hunger drive or and they were measuring with saliva. Okay, now this is probably one of the kind of the little cruel parts of his experiments, is in order to measure that, he took a little vial and he surgically connected it to one of the dog's saliva glands. Okay, so he kind of put a little suture through the little jaw, connected it to a saliva gland so that when it secreted saliva, it would fill up the little tube and they can measure how much the dog salivated. Okay, but as the probably, and I'm pretty sure the fairy tale goes, the story goes, one day Pavlov was just sitting in his lab, and he noticed that one of the dogs started to salivate, even though there was no food present. And at that time, there would have been no reason for that dog to be salivating other than the presentation of the food. Okay. And so he got curious why an animal would salivate without the stimulus of a food being present. Okay. And as he started to notice what and whatnot, is he noticed that the dogs in the lab would start to salivate when they heard their caretaker, their feeder, walk in the room and they could hear the boots or the shoes of their feeder and caretaker coming towards them. And that's when they would start to salivate. Um, and so he came up with this idea that shoes or tapping of the shoes should not elicit salivation. Okay. And so he started to develop an experiment and he came up with some terms. Okay. He did a pre experiment, which is this before conditioning, the experiment, which is going to be this conditioning part, and then his after measure, his effect, what his after measure is going to be. Okay. But he's going to call these things a little bit different terms. So, food, so something that naturally elicits a response in an organism is what's known as an unconditional stimulus. So, UCS, meaning unconditional stimulus. Okay. The unconditioned response then is called an unconditioned response. Okay. And you can think of a lot of things that could elicit natural responses to an organism. You could think of visions of things that are beautiful, like flowers, eliciting emotions of joy, as an example. You could do visuals of someone being harmed, which would bring up feelings of fear or anger. Okay. And all of those are unconditioned stimuluses that didn't need to necessarily be learned. Okay. Now, on the other hand, we have, when it comes to salivation, a neutral stimulus that doesn't naturally give a response such as salivation. So a bell might give a startle response, okay, but it doesn't create salivation usually. I'm sure there's some weirdos out there. But so this is what's known as the neutral stimulus, okay? And so what Pavlov did is he paired the neutral stimulus with the unconditional stimulus over and over. So he'd ring the bell, present the food, ring the bell, present the food. Okay. And what he found over time is that the neutral stimulus became a conditioned stimulus that then would produce salivation in the animal called a conditioned response. So CS is conditioned stimulus, CR is conditioned response. Okay. Now, why is it important after this to differentiate? Why isn't the bell then called an unconditioned stimulus? And why isn't the salivation still an unconditioned response? The reason is because if you continue to ring the bell over and over and over without presenting the food, then the salivation will eventually go away. Okay, so while this will produce a conditioned response for a while, if food isn't introduced once in a while with the bell, the dog will start to salivate. Okay. And this was kind of, again, and we'll go back to, so let's fast forward. So he came up with these rules, he came up with these laws. Interestingly, Pavlov was not a behaviorist. Pavlov actually, in his book about classical conditioning, actually tried to provide the neural basis, the brain basis for this to occur. So he very much thought this was a brain process. But then, as we saw with our lecture yesterday, Watson, John B. Watson, is going to say, well, no, the important part isn't anything that's going on in the neural brain mechanisms. It's just the stimulus in the environment and the response of the organism. Okay. And this is what's going to lead Watson to believe that fear and a lot of our natural responses to things like danger and to certain foods and whatnot are learned. They're not built in, meaning that we're not born afraid of, for example, snakes or spiders or anything like that, that it is a conditioned response. Okay. And how's he going to do this? He's going to do it through an infamous experiment with little Albert, who was a very young infant. I think he was, he was barely almost at crawling age. And what he's going to do is he's going to try and prove that fear, as an example, is a classically conditioned response. Okay. And so what is he going to do? Well, first he's going to present little Albert with things that we're usually fearful of. So a guy in a scary mask, a newspaper on fire, and some different things. And then he's going to present things that maybe we are, but we're not. So he's going to present a little white rat. Okay. And to all of these stimuli, little Albert isn't afraid of them. He approaches the fire, he approaches the mask, and just like any 6-month-old or so, he of course tries to put them all in his mouth and just play with them and figure them out. Okay. But then what Watson did is he would present the little white rat, and then he would do a banging noise behind little Albert's head, which would do the startle response, of course. And he would do kind of what Pavlov did with his dog and his food. He'd present he would present the food, do the loud bang, present the little white rat, do the loud bang, present the little white rat, do the bang. And eventually, just at the presentation of the little white rat, little Albert would start to cry and try to crawl away from it. Okay. And so this video, he was so sure of it, he actually videoed it for preservation. But let me play kind of a short little clip of this little experiment.
To prove that environment is more powerful than genetics, Watson designs an experiment for an infant known as Little Albert. He's so confident, he films it for posterity. At first, Albert shows little fear, even when Watson places a burning newspaper in front of him. Albert is also unafraid when he encounters a white rat for the first time in his life. But then Watson shows Albert the rat accompanied by a loud clanging noise. One of the few things that upsets little Albert. And he does it again. And does it again. Eventually, Albert learns to fear not just the rat, but all furry things, even without the loud noise. In Watson's mind, the little Albert experiment is a success because it proves that fears are learned, not inherited.
Okay. Okay, so I'll get to this graph for just a minute, but just a little bit of a background on that little Albert experiment is there was some positive and I think some negative outcomes of that experiment. One is that they never did what's called counter conditioning with little Albert. So it was, and after the experiment, him and his mom left and kind of disappeared. We think little Albert actually died around the age of 11 or 12 from a childhood disorder from that era. But we don't know what actually happened with little Albert. That's kind of the sad part. Probably the positive part of it is that it actually ended up developing one of the most, one of the best treatment modalities for phobias, fears, and post-traumatic stress disorder, which is exposure therapy. Okay. I'll take a kind of a phobia of a snake. What do you do when you're doing exposure therapy? Well, you slowly present the stimuli to the patient until they no longer have a fear response. So, for example, we strap some physiological things that measure heart rate, measure blood pressure, measure maybe how sweaty your palms are getting, the moisture conduction kind of tools and those kinds of things. And let's take a snake, for example, is we start by just showing them a picture of a snake. Um, uh, and then we measure it until they no longer respond to it. Okay. And then we put them in a room where in the next room there's a snake and they know there's a snake in that room, and you measure it until they no longer fear it. And then you put them in a room with a snake in a cage, do that for a while, and then you put them in the cage with the snake to where they can touch it. Okay. That's a really very basic and kind of oversimplified example of exposure therapy. Interestingly, exposure therapy does not work very well with social phobias, mainly because social phobias are very much more complex than just exposing people to other people. But I did mention that it is actually very effective and is actually one of the top types of treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder, where yes, you slowly expose the person to the trauma event or the trauma memories, and you have them do calming techniques until they can fully tell you about the trauma event without having a trauma response. Okay. And I know this sounds strange, but that has been probably the best treatment so far for post-traumatic stress disorder. And this is also why if there's been some articles out that some military individuals with combat PTSD actually find relief by doing first shooter video games because they're exposing themselves to that trauma that they went through. So kind of some interesting things that works for certain types of phobias and fears like fears of snakes. I think Joanna said tarantulas, I think you said it worked for. Um, it does not work very well for social anxiety or social phobias, but it does work for things like post-traumatic stress disorders. So, and certain other non-social anxiety disorders. So, kind of an interesting thing to think about when it comes to some of the effectiveness of some of these things that came out of the little Albert experiments. But I feel really bad for the little guy, not knowing what he ever came of him. You'll also notice in the little Albert experiments the generalization where it went from little white rats to basically anything furry and fuzzy. And that's the idea of generalization. Okay. Now, I mentioned that you can extinguish a conditioned response. So we go through the acquisition phase. And then if we just present the conditioned stimulus alone, eventually it will become extinct, that the response will not come true, okay? Or it won't produce anything. But then if we don't have a continuum, let's say we have a rest period, and we then come across that condition stimulus, we can have a spontaneous recovery, okay, where it's not as strong as before, but we can have that conditioned stimulus response. And this is something that we have experienced again with the treatment of phobias and whatnot, that a lot of times you do have to go in for some refresher treatment sessions in order not to have this spontaneous recovery. I often think of these stages as the girlfriend boyfriend experience. Okay, so you get with someone and they're wonderful, and you associate them with love and joy and everything, and wow, they're amazing. And so you've got this conditioned stimulus and unconditioned stimulus, and you're really, man, you're in love with them. But then something happens and you break up, and then you don't have those conditioned stimuluses, so your feelings for them go to extinction. So you get to that point after the breakup where you go, okay, I don't feel that way anymore. Okay. And then maybe 3 4 weeks, maybe a couple months go by, and for us out in cells or somewhere, maybe we go to Bashas' or a grocery store, and we run into him and her. And this is where we often make this mistake. And I know most everyone has made this mistake. You look at that person and you go, why did I ever break up with them? Oh, I feel all these emotions. Why did I break up with them? And then if we make the mistake, we then go approach them and see how they're doing, and then we start to get this back. But I will say, just leave the grocery store and those feelings will go away. Anyway, so that's one way to think about how this conditioning, we acquire some associative learning. Then if it's not associated, once in a while it'll go away. But then if they're gone for a long time and we come back and faced with that conditioned stimulus, it can return to some level and kind of make us think, oh geez, wow, what did I do? So that's kind of an example of these different phases of classical conditioning. Okay. Now, operant conditioning is a little bit different. Okay. Operant conditioning is when we have an event and then we have some type of response. Okay. And then either we're reinforced or we're punished. If we're reinforced, that increases the probability of the behavior in the future. If we're punished, that reduces the probability of that behavior in the future. Okay. Now, this is where in the lecture I have to make it very clear, because this is where a lot of students, I did myself, make the differentiate the difference between positive and negative. Because usually when we're talking about psychology, we put a emotional valence on positive and negative, meaning more positive, more negative. Okay. Don't think of that way. Okay. Positive means that we add something to the situation. Okay. Negative in this case means that we're going to take away something. Okay. So, for example, in positive reinforcement, all right, um, uh, we have an event. Uh, we tell our child to go clean their room. Child cleans their room. We give them a piece of candy. So we added something to the situation, and it's reinforcement because it's pleasurable. So that will increase, hopefully, the probability that the child will clean their room when you ask them the next time. Okay. In negative reinforcement, our child, um, um, in negative reinforcement, let me think of a good one. Um, the fire alarm goes off. We leave the building, which makes it so we can't hear the fire alarm anymore. So we're taking away a stimuli that is harmful or obnoxious or something like that. Okay. And that increases the probability that if we hear the fire alarm in the future, we'll run outside the building. Okay. So that's negative reinforcement. Positive punishment is, well, we could go with a stereotypical corporal punishment event. Um, um, uh, a child sees a cookie. This is a sad one. Child sees a cookie. Child takes cookie when they weren't supposed to. So dad slaps their hand. So they add something that's harmful in some way, or something that is not pleasurable. And that hopefully reduces the probability that the child will do that in the future. Okay. Let's think of another one. So for negative punishment, let's say child is at a party. They're supposed to be home by 10 p.m. The child's response is that they come home at 10:30 p.m. And so you take away their Nintendo. Okay. So you're taking away something that is usually positive to them, or I shouldn't use that word positive, that is joyful to them, which puts them in a negative state, which hopefully makes it so that they won't be late after curfew again. Now, most of you parents in this room are probably laughing at this because maybe you've tried it and it didn't work. But let's go through some of these a little bit closer. I want to look at some of these other slides because this is a really smart class. So I don't know if we need to go through these. Now I'm going to stick with this slide. There's two situations that I want to bring up that deal with positive and negative reinforcement, but also positive and negative punishment. Okay. The first one is a child throwing a tantrum in a grocery store. Okay. So you have the event, which is grocery shopping. You have the behavior of a child crying, throwing his arms, all these things, wanting a candy, yelling, want a candy bar, I want a candy bar, I want a candy bar, I want a candy bar, da 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 da, yelling, screaming, da da da. Okay. So what does maybe mom do or dad do? Well, they give the child the candy bar, um, and the child's behavior stops. Okay. The problem is none of this fits the notions of operant conditioning, okay? And this also, I want to highlight the complexity of things like tantrum behaviors, because there's two types of reinforcement that are going on here, okay? One, the child is being reinforced, positively reinforced for their tantrum. You gave them the candy bar, that will increase the probability that next time they're in the grocery store, they will throw a tantrum or give that behavioral response. However, and this begins the complexity of child tantrums, mom is being negatively reinforced. Okay. So how's that working? So child is throwing a tantrum that puts mom in a negative state. Mom gives the candy bar, that's her behavioral response. And the tantrum stops, and that puts her in a negatively reinforced state, a calmer state. So what's mom going to do? That's going to increase the probability that that behavior will increase in the future. Okay. And this is why tantrum behavior is so hard to eliminate, because you have two people who are largely on an unconscious basis being reinforced for the tantrum at the grocery store. Okay. And indeed, what we have found is we can work with a child, we can get them to stop tantruming, but some interesting studies show that mom actually will do unconscious behaviors to try and engage that child into a tantrum. So, for example, we'll train the child and da da da, or maybe we will bribe the child not to throw a tantrum without telling mom. So, mom is unaware that we bribed their child. And we record them as they go through the grocery store. If the child does not throw a tantrum at the first approach of the candy aisle, where the candy bar usually is, mom actually will pass that candy aisle 5 times more. And she will put her cart closer towards the candy bar than she usually does. Okay. What is she trying to do? She's trying to produce a state that usually is rewarding for her. I know that sounds very strange, but I want you to think about how often we do this in our real world. Okay. So we know that a hot salsa is going to put us in a negative state, but the euphoria that it creates afterwards is really satisfying. Okay. Another example can be things like skydiving, cliff hanging, free falling. All of those put us in a negative condition that then becomes very reinforcing. Okay. So, what we have found is that if you do know someone or have a child who does a tantrum, you actually have to do counter conditioning with both the child and the parent. Okay, you have to change both of their behaviors as they go through a grocery store or wherever they go. Okay. Let's give an example then of positive and negative punishment. And I'll return to the example that was given, that I gave when I brought this up, a child with a I can't think all of a sudden, that isn't coming to curfew, okay, or goes past curfew. So we'll put it at 10 p.m. Now I want you to imagine, you're 14, 15, 16 years old. It's 10:30. It's 9:30. You're supposed to be home by 10. But you are smashing it on the Nintendo. Okay. I mean, you're scoring the highest scores that you've scored. And people keep handing you this liquid in this blue blue plastic cup that kind of makes you feel good. And there is some, let's say you're a guy and you like girls, and there's these girls that you didn't know were going to show up, and they're actually paying attention to you. And then it's 9:45, you look at the clock, maybe it takes you 10 minutes to get home. But if you are in that situation, are you really going to care if you are going to, let's say, be spanked, or you're going to get your Nintendo taken away when you get home? The answer is probably no. Okay. So positive punishment, the kid comes home at 11 o'clock, let's say dad, or even mom or uncle or aunt or grandpa, grandma, whoever does the punishment that they say they were going to get. They spank them, or they take their keys away, or they take their Nintendo away. Okay. Question is, and I hope you probably all know this answer, is that going to be an effective deterrent the next time that teenager is in that situation? Did you effectively use positive punishment and negative punishment in order to change that child's behavior? And if you're any parent in the room, you're probably saying no. If you have a really good kid, you're probably saying yes, or sometimes. Okay. But most of the time, we actually fail at doing these things because we do something that we shouldn't do when we're using either reinforcement or punishment. Okay. And this is the caveat to human learning, is whenever you implement the notion of choice, these rules of operant conditioning no longer work. They go out the window. Okay. So if you think about the kid who you say, hey, if you're home late, I'm going to spank you. Or if you're home late, I'm going to take away your Nintendo. Because you've implemented the notion of choice, then this probably will not work. Okay. If you're one of those parents that say, if you do all your homework this week, this Friday we'll have pizza, most likely your kids probably don't do their homework all week if they're those kids that don't do their homework, because you've implemented the notion of choice. Okay. So this is one of the first rules that we break when we're doing operant conditioning with human beings. Okay. So what do you do with the child when they ask, so what happens if I'm not home at 10? You just simply say, you'll find out. Okay. With punishment. All right. Um, um, uh, uh, and you don't give them that notion of choice, because that's going to create cognitive dissonance when they're in that pleasure zone, but they're completely unaware what's going to happen, or what it's unknown what's going to happen if they don't follow a rule. Okay. With positive and negative reinforcement, it's actually coming up with a reinforcer that reinforces behaviors in a stepwise, meaning that you don't tell with changing behavior for reinforcement, you don't tell the child to go clean their room and they'll get a candy bar. You reward behavior every time they do something that is progressing towards cleaning their room. So maybe they pick up a toy, so you give them a huge hug. Then next time, maybe they pick up 2 or 3 toys and you give them a big hug. Okay. Now, when we get to social learning, we'll show some modeling of this. So that's the other level of this. But when we're using pure operant conditioning, it's that you don't tell the child what they can do that's positive and that what the reward is going to be. You reward that behavior every time you see it. Okay. All right. So let's go back to the kiddo that's late for what we call an N1 thing. So what can you do as a parent that will make sure that a child is there for curfew? So you know the child is supposed to be there at 10 p.m. So you make sure that if the child is not there, that you know the location of the party and you're close to the party location and you show up with your pajamas and curlers or whatever you wear and decent, and you knock on the door and you ask for little Billy. Okay, I promise you the child will not be late for curfew after that. It might create some negative issues for you. It might create a situations that's negatively punishing for you or negatively reinforcing for you for a while, but that's kind of a recommendation. Anyways, so two things that make this work and not work with humans. One, reinforcements have to immediately follow the behavior in order for rewards to work. Okay. Two, in order for both of these to work, both reinforcement and punishment, you can't implement the cognitive notion of choice. Either you're late or you get your Nintendo taken away. Once you've done that, these rules go away for human beings. Okay. So just some notes on those things. All right. And we'll end with this today. We'll get out of here a few minutes early. I just want to note the different reinforcement schedules. Okay. So there's two types of reinforcement schedules. There's intervals, meaning that you reinforce over time, and there's ratios. You reinforce based on the number of responses that you want to see in your pet or in your boyfriend. Okay. And then within those, there's two types. So there's variable ratio and there's fixed ratio. There's variable interval and there's fixed interval. Okay. In the most basic one, fixed ratio, is you give a reward every time the organism does that behavior. Okay. In variable ratio, you give it variable. So maybe they do it 2 times and you reinforce, 1 time you reinforce, 5 times, then you reinforce, 10 times, then you reinforce. So you vary the number of responses that they have to do to get that reinforcement, but you don't tell them. Okay. In variable interval, while in fixed variable, they get a reward based on time. So if you want to think about this, this is your bi-weekly paycheck. So you get a reward for showing up to work bi-weekly. Okay. Variable interval is that you get a reward not based upon how many times you commit a behavior, but randomly. Okay. So if you want to think about this, this is trying to think of a good example of this. Is that instead of giving your child a reward based on the number of times they do it, well, here's a good example. Sometimes you reward the child randomly every day, then maybe every 3 or 4 days, then maybe every 6 days. This is kind of an inconsistent kind of person that rewards this. Okay. So which is the best? Well, the best is always starting out with a fixed ratio and then going to a variable ratio. Okay. If you want to think about this, this is gambling. And this is why, if you notice, this has the biggest steep in it. Okay. Because you don't know which time you pull down that lever, you're going to get rewarded. It might be that next time you keep pulling that lever. And then eventually you're rewarded every time you pull the lever, and then again every 50th time you pull the lever. And that's what creates gambling and gambling addiction, or why people spend so much time at the slot machines. Okay. The kind of worst type of reinforcement are the interval ones. Okay. If you look at our biweekly paycheck, okay, just after our paycheck, our performance, if we measure it, actually decreases a little bit. But then when it gets closer to paycheck, our performance increases. And then it stays off a little while. So this is for example, this is this right here. If you get paid on Friday, this is this is Saturday to that next Friday. So this is week one of a biweekly paycheck. You kind of just do the job. And then from the second Saturday to the next Friday is where we actually see performance increase. Okay. So this is a fixed variable. It creates what's called a scalloped performance. Okay. If you want more steady performance, you could maybe pay your employees randomly, because that's not going to create the performance decrease or flattening off that we see with fixed intervals. But I'll tell you, you probably will have a lot of turnover because that creates a few budget problems for your employees. But it does create consistent performance. Trade-offs are not recommended. Okay, so these are the different things. Again, when we look at rate of learning, rate of response, the variable ratio is the number one. The best example of this is gambling. The least ones that create least learning and least behavior change are the ones that deal with time. Okay. All right. Okay. So I'm going to escape out of here. Stop. All right. I said we get out of here a few minutes early, right? So I'm going to stop the recording and just ask, does anybody have any questions about operant or classical conditioning as we presented it today? I know we went over quite a bit, but does anybody have any questions for today? Thank you, Teddy. All right. Thank you, Shayna. All right. All right. All right. Well, that ends us for today. Please, everybody, have a wonderful weekend. Take care of yourselves, take care of your family, and I look forward to seeing you all on Monday.